Stanford University.
Welcome to Stanford Medicine's Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Lawrence Barsalou for his session titled Taking a Situated Approach to the Design of Contemplative Practices and Interventions. Professor Barsalou is a professor of psychology at the University of Glasgow, conducting research in the Institute of Neuroscience and Psychology. Barsalou's research addresses the nature of human conceptual processing and its roles in perception, memory, language, thought, social interaction, and human cognition. A current theme of his research is that the conceptual system is grounded in multimodal simulation, situated conceptualization, and embodiment. Specific topics of current interest include the roles of conceptual processing in emotion, stress, abstract thought, self, appetitive behavior, and contemplative practices. His research also addresses the dynamic online construction of conceptual representations, the development of conceptual systems to support goal achievement, and the structure of knowledge. Barsalou's research has been funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation and other U.S. funding agencies. He has held a Guggenheim Fellowship, served as the chair of the Cognitive Science Society, and won an award for graduate teaching from the University of Chicago. Barsalou is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, the Cognitive Science Society, the Mind and Life Institute, and the Society of Experimental Psychologists. He is a winner of the Distinguished Cognitive Science Award from the University of California, Merced. He received a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of California, San Diego, and a PhD in cognitive psychology from Stanford University. Barsalou has held faculty positions at Emory University, the Georgia Institute of Technology, and the University of Chicago, joining the University of Glasgow in 2015. Welcome, Professor Barsalou.
Thank you so much, Tia. Let me share my screen. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be part of the summit. I've really enjoyed thinking about contemplative design and have learned a lot from pulling this material together into a talk I've never given before. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is taking a situated approach to the design of contemplative practices and interventions. And I will start with the construct and measurement of traits, which provides a good baseline for understanding everything that will follow related to situations. I'll then talk about the importance of situations and the problems that they pose for the traits perspective. I'll then talk about individual by situation interactions, which is the phenomenon whereby different individuals experience and act differently in the same situations. I'll then suggest that that situation effects and their interactions with individuals result through the process of enactment via the situated action cycle, which conditions the cognitive affective system to produce situation effects. I realize that this sounds like that this is a pretty scientific sounding set of topics, but I think you'll see as I work through them that they're related to classic contemplative constructs such as impermanence, interdependence, and enactment. I'll also be presenting examples from contemplative science throughout this material, and then in the final section, I'll present some implications for contemplative design. Okay, before diving into all this material, it's important to make a couple of preliminary points. And the first is that in the process of designing practices and interventions, it's essential to balance tradition and innovation. For centuries, contemplative traditions have been developing and evaluating practices that are tried and true. Many of us have benefited from these practices tremendously. Nevertheless, scholars of contemplative traditions note frequently that these traditions continually evolve over time as they're exported to new times and places. And indeed, one could argue that design thinking is central to this evolutionary process, that as teachers are working with various practices and transmitting them, that they're constantly tweaking them in various ways and trying to redesign them to maximize their reach and effectiveness, assessing how they work and then iterating through the design process. And indeed, it shouldn't be surprising to see that this kind of innovation has been taking place tremendously in the last 50 years as we have new practice communities and contexts coming into the world, and we have modern input from traditional practitioners, and we have many impacts of basic and clinical science, all working together in the innovation process. But again, it's important to strike a balance between innovation and tradition. A second preliminary point is that it's important to engage stakeholders. In the particular approach that I'll be developing, situations will play a central role, and in developing situated practices, it would be absolutely essential to source these situations from the end users of these practices. You wouldn't want to just try to design those yourself. And similarly, for the practices and interventions that are implemented within these situations, you'd want to obtain input from traditional teachers, Western teachers, scientists, and so forth. So again, a good baseline for understanding everything that will follow is the construct and measurement of traits. Traits are generally viewed as intrinsic properties of individuals that reflect their genetic contributions and a lifetime of developmental experience. Typically, traits are viewed as internal causal dispositions that are continually present and active and that causally express themselves in behavior. Classic examples of traits include intelligence, the Big Five personality, characteristics such as extroversion and agreeableness, contemplative traits such as mindfulness, compassion, and generosity, and a whole host of other traits that have been examined in myriad contexts over the years. It's useful to examine how the assessment of traits takes place because it sheds insight onto the theoretical construct itself. So if you assume that people have an internal disposition that causes their behavior, then if you want to assess this trait and understand it, you would try to develop a measurement tool that can give you an accurate measurement of each person's trait relative to other people. And the way that this is typically done is that clinicians and researchers sample items that accurately measure the trait and then have people respond to them, aggregate the results to come up with an overall score such that you position people along a continuum of variability for the trait. Typically, when someone tries to develop an instrument like this, they try to come up with a set of items that all tap into the same trait and that are coherent in measuring it. And if you have a set of items that are sufficiently coherent, say an interclass correlation of 0.4, then you need about 8 such items to have a reasonable stability of the measure. So if you measure a person on one occasion, it will give you an accurate prediction of how much they exhibit that trait on later occasions. There are many classic examples of these kinds of instruments, such as the Big Five personality assessment tool, the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, the perceived stress scale, and many others. Let's look at the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire to get a better sense of this approach. The FFMQ assesses 5 facets of mindfulness: awareness, in other words, not mind-wandering, being present; observing, describing, being non-reactive to your feelings and emotions, especially when distressing; and being non-judgmental about yourself, thoughts, emotions, and others. The FFMQ has a total of 39 items that it uses to assess these 5 facets. And here are the 39 items. Here are the first 16. So these first 8 items all measure a person's awareness. And note that they're reverse scored, which means that in this case, what each item measures is how much people mind wander. So when I do things, my mind wanders off and I'm easily distracted. So it's kind of measuring the opposite of awareness. So when these items are scored, the responses that a person gives are flipped around the middle of the scale, so that when somebody responds highly to this, it means that they have low awareness. Or if they respond lowly to this, if they respond 1 to when I do things, my mind wanders off, that would be scored as being high in awareness. And the way that you produce an overall awareness measure is you add up the scores for all of these items, and it gives you an overall measure of awareness. And the same thing would be done for the observe items, for the describe items, the non-reactive items, and the items that measure non-judgmentalness. Let's see. Okay. So when you collect data with this instrument, these are the kinds of results you get. This is a study that I performed with former postdoc Leo Dutrio. This was a sample of 161 participants from the UK, all students in the age of 18 to 30, fluent English speakers. They were from the general UK population, not the University of Glasgow. And each point here is an individual score on the questions that measure that facet of the FFMQ. So this point here is the average, is the sum of the 8 items for awareness for this one particular participant. And each other point similarly represents the score for one of these facets. And so you can see that there's a large range of individual differences for each of these subscales, which is what you would want to see. But it demonstrates that people vary widely in how much awareness they experience, how non-reactive they are, how non-judgmental, and so forth. Now, one question that you could ask is, do these scores represent traits? So do these scores for awareness represent traits of awareness or traits of non-reactivity? Well, a researcher who spent much of his career at Stanford, Walter Mischel, argued strongly against the idea that data like the ones we just looked at represent traits in people. He argued that traits are an illusion. There are no such causal dispositions within individuals that are determining their behavior. Instead, he argued that traits are only conceptual constructions that perceivers use to explain the actions of others. And an example that's often given is when you look out at the nice California weather and you say that it's nice, you would never imagine that nice is actually part of the physics that constitutes the weather you're seeing. Instead, it's something that you as a perceiver are attributing to that physical event. And Mischel argued the same thing is true of personality traits or contemplative traits, that something like being non-reactive is just, that's a construction that a perceiver might use to describe an individual, but it's not actually a mechanism in an individual that's causing their behavior. This is related to the contemplative construct of impermanence and often how it's discussed in the contemplative community. Often practitioners are advised to avoid viewing things as permanent, and sort of the illusion of permanence is something that is often treated in contemplative training. Instead, the idea is that everything is constantly in flux and impermanent. And even though I don't think Mischel was a Buddhist, I think he was very much on this wavelength. Mischel also offered a very strong empirical case against the idea that there are traits in individuals. And the nature of the evidence that he collected was he would measure a trait in individuals in different situations. So he might take the trait of extroversion, for example, and look and measure people's extroversion in one situation, measure their extroversion in another situation, and then look at how well you could predict a person's extroversion in the second situation from their extroversion in the first. And he reviewed a tremendous amount of literature that assessed these kinds of predictive relationships across situations for traits. And generally, he found only correlations or predictive power of about 0.2 to 0.3. In other words, knowing someone's extroversion on one occasion only allows you to predict it with a correlation of 0.2, which is relatively low. It's fairly close to zero. You get very little information about someone from knowing how extroverted they are in a situation. And so Michel argued, well, if you don't see consistency in these traits in individuals across situations, how can you argue that they have traits that are determining their behavior? And what he argued instead is what's driving people's behavior are the situations they're in, and that's why their extroversion varies so much. So to get a more concrete sense of this situational variability, let's look at some psychometric evidence from a study that we performed here in Glasgow. We assessed individuals' distress and eustress during the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, on 3 occasions 1 week apart. And what we did was we measured both their distress and their eustress. And for those of you who don't know haven't run into eustress before, it's positive stress. It's like when you experience a challenging situation, experiencing success, growth, meaning, efficacy, and so forth. Whereas distress is more of a negative experience of a challenging situation. So this was a UK-wide sample from areas of the UK with high COVID infection rates. Participants ranged in age from 18 to 70. And we used something called the situated assessment method, which is a psychometric tool that we've developed that takes a situated approach to measuring health and social behaviors. And what's unique about it is it comes up with psychometric measurements that are grounded in the situations where the health and social behaviors occur. And it's very unlike most surveys like the FFMQ that I just showed you that use unsituated test items. So to make this concrete, I'm going to show you the most commonly used psychometric tool for assessing stress. It's called the Perceived Stress Scale, and it has 10 items in it. And people are asked to evaluate themselves on each of these 10 items. And what you can see is that there's absolutely nothing said in these items about situations. You're supposed to come up with general impressions of yourself that provide answers to these questions. And what we did instead was we asked people to evaluate distress and also eustress across 20 specific situations that I'll show you in a second. And what people were asked to evaluate was in each situation, how much distress have you occurred in this situation when you experienced it recently, and then in a later block of trials to evaluate how much eustress you experienced. So these are the 20 situations we had them evaluate. They're all related to the lockdown. 8 of them are situations where I think most people would experience distress. 6 were situations where we thought people might experience eustress, and 6 were situations that we thought people would find non-stressful. And again, we had people evaluating all 20 situations for how much distress they experience in them and how much eustress they experience in them. So the first way to look at our data and to look at this issue about the relative importance of individuals and situations is to use something called generalizability theory. And generalizability theory was developed by another amazing Stanford researcher, Lee Cronbach, who's probably best known for Cronbach's alpha, one of the most widely misunderstood statistics in psychology, and he would have been the first to agree to that. But what generalizability theory does is it takes all, so we have roughly 20,000 distress judgments in this study, and it asks the question, if you just know who the individuals are, if you take these 303 individuals and you try to predict the stress on each of these 20,000 trials by just the individual, how much variance can you explain? And this is the amount of variance you can explain by knowing the individual, and the total amount of variance you would get by stacking all these bars together. So then the second bar is the amount of variance you can explain in the 20,000 distress judgments if you know which of the 20 situations was being evaluated. And what's interesting here is you see almost twice as much variance being explained by the situations as by the individuals, which would be consistent with Michelle's argument that situations are more important for determining someone's experience than the individuals, than something like traits in individuals. The other really interesting bar, the third bar here is for occasions, whether we measured them, whether their judgments were coming from, whether from the first, second, or third week. And this explains virtually no variance. Their judgments were relatively constant over this 3-week period. Some individuals varied, but in general, on the average, there was you can't predict the stress someone's experienced by the week. This third bar is really interesting, and I will be making a lot of this as we go through this material. This is the individual by situation interaction. And it basically captures how much variance can be explained by the combination of the individual and the situation. It basically more generally can be interpreted as capturing how much individuals vary in the stress they experience in these 20 situations. And this will become clearer in a second. Here's the same variance plot for eustress, and you see the same pattern. Again, the situations are explaining the most variance, followed by the interaction with individuals. Both of these are more important than the individuals, again, arguing against the importance of traits being, trait level variables being the most important thing that's determining the stress someone's experiencing. This figure here, it looks complicated and busy, but it's actually very simple. This figure shows the roughly 20,000 stress. No, actually, these are averaged across the 3 occasions. So this shows the distress judgments for each of the 303 participants. So each row represents a participant's 20 judgments of distress. Each column represents the distress judgments for one situation. So these first 8 columns are for the 8 distress situations. The next 6 columns are for the 6 eustress situations, and the final 6 columns are for the neutral situations. Each cell is a visual representation of the distress level on the 0 to 10 scale. So the redder the cell, the more distress the person experienced in that situation. So down here you can see these participants experiencing a lot of distress in situation 1. So basically, if you look across a row again, you can see all the distress judgments for a single participant. And what you can see is that the individuals, and so if you want to look, you can sort of compute an individual's overall stress level by averaging the color across the 20 situations. So these participants down here on the bottom are experiencing the most stress overall because they would have the reddest rows. Whereas these participants here are experiencing the least distress because they have the bluest rows. And then these people up here are experiencing intermediate amounts of stress. So there are clearly individual differences. This is what this variance component here is capturing for individuals. The situations component is coming from the differences between the columns, and you can see there are dramatic differences between the columns and how much stress is experienced. So the first 8 columns for the distress, the situations have much higher distress ratings than do the columns for eustress and for the non-stressful situations. This one column here is for finding a new way of handling your financial affairs. We thought this might generate eustress in people, but it clearly generated a lot of distress. So I'll be talking a lot about individual level effects, which are the sort of the average value of the row. I'll be talking about situation effects, which is the average, in this case, redness of the columns. And then we have the individual by situation interactions. And that's captured by how much the rows differ overall. And you can certainly see if you look row by row that the individuals differ considerably between themselves, but where you can really see this coming out is in the clusters of individuals. So this cluster of individuals right here has very different responses from these individuals and from these individuals and from these individuals down here. And so all these differences between individuals is being captured by this individual by situation interaction. And I'll be talking about these a lot as we go through this material. This 0.23 down here comes from generalizability theory, and it tells you the average level of agreement between the rows. If there was perfect agreement in how participants experience the situations, if every participant had the same relative level of distress in each of the 20 situations, this value would be 1. If there was complete disagreement, it would be 0. The fact that it's 0.23 means that there's considerable disagreement, which is why that interaction term is so high. Here's the same result for eustress, and you can see it's just the inverse in a sense, not exactly, but of distress, where now these situations are where people are experiencing more eustress. But again, you have huge differences between individuals. You have these people down here who don't experience any eustress at all. These people experience some, and these people experience the most. So then basically what we've seen is that there are significant effects of individuals. You might think these correspond to traits. I'm going to be arguing later that that's not the right way to think about them, and Michelle certainly wouldn't have liked to have talked about these as traits either. But then there are also huge effects of situations. They explain the most variance in this plot, and also very large situation by individual interactions. We've looked at these kinds of plots across quite a few different domains at this point, which are all listed here, and we always see exactly this same general pattern that basically you see these three kinds of effects roughly in these relative magnitudes for each other. So this is a very robust pattern of results, which I think is telling us something basic and fundamental about human behavior. So what about mindfulness? Does mindfulness exhibit this kind of patterning? And so what we did to assess this was we used the SAM squared kind of approach that I just showed you for stress to measure the 5 facets of the FFMQ. And we used the same sample that I showed you earlier when I showed you the FFMQ data. That was from the same sample. And what we did was we had these 161 participants perform the FFMQ first. And then we had them perform this SAM squared procedure, and I'll show you how this worked in more detail. So basically, if you recall in the FFMQ, nothing was asked about situations. Here we're going to ask people to evaluate the 5 facets in 48 different situations related to university and work, housing, finance, health, home, and relationships. And within each of these 6 domains, we ask them to evaluate the 5 facets in 4 stressful situations, and we also ask them to evaluate the 5 facets in 4 non-stressful situations. And the way we did this was that the way we actually asked them to evaluate the 5 facets in these situations was we took the FFMQ items. So here are the 8 items that the FFMQ uses to measure awareness, and we created a single item that captured what we see as the most critical information in these 8 items. There's actually a lot of redundancy among these 8 items, which we tried to remove. But basically, this one item captures a lot of the same information that's in the FFMQ. We think it's pretty equivalent. And we did this for each of the 5 facets. So we came up with a single question for each of these 5 facets. And again, what we did was we asked each of these 5 questions for the 48 situations. And we typically randomize the order they answer these questions. So they might get described first. They would evaluate how much they find words to describe what you're feeling and thinking in each of the 48 situations. Then they might do the same thing for the non-judgmentalists for the 48 situations and so forth. And when we do that, we again get a large range of individual differences. So I need to tell you what each of these points is. So recall here that each of the points in the FFMQ is the sum of the scores across the 8 items that went into that scale. Here, each point is the average judgment of awareness across the 48 situations. So there's actually a lot more data going into each of these points than there is in the FFMQ. And the evaluations are coming from 48 very diverse situations as well. Again, you can see that there's a very large spread of variability, just as we see for the FFMQ on the left. Okay, here's the same kind of visualization that I showed you earlier for stress, and this is now for awareness. Again, awareness has been reverse scored. So redder cells refer to higher levels of awareness. Blue cells refer to lower levels of awareness and being highly distracted. Again, each row shows the judgments for a single participant. So the first row shows the 48 awareness judgments for the first participant. The second row shows the 48 awareness judgments for the second participant, and so forth. Each column shows the awareness judgments for a particular situation. Again, you can see the same pattern we saw earlier for stress. There are clearly differences between rows. So for example, this group down here shows the highest awareness. The group above them shows the lowest awareness, and then these other two groups show intermediate levels of awareness. There are clearly major differences in the situations. So generally, these are the non-stressful situations that are being picked up in this cluster here. The non-stressful situations generally show slightly less awareness than do the stress situations, which is interesting in itself. People say they're generally more aware in the stress situations than in the non-stress situations. Maybe they're less on automatic. But then we have the individual by situation interaction, and that's the differences between the rows. And you see really striking things here. So this group down here is less aware in the non-stressful situations. This group here tends to be a little bit less aware in the stressful situations. So these are just massive individual differences in how these two groups are experiencing the same situations. And the fact that the interclass correlation is only 0.06, where again, 0 means no agreement between participants, tells you how little agreement, how differently people are experiencing awareness across these 20 situations. And here's the same thing for observe, and then here are all 5 patterns. So it's really interesting how different the patterns are for each of the 5 facets, but in general you see individual effects, situation effects, and the individual by situation interaction. So what Michelle would argue is that this strongly suggests that you shouldn't be thinking about something like awareness or non-judgmentalness as a trait, because it's not fixed. If it were fixed, you would expect to see a fixed value across the row for a particular participant. But you see tremendous variability across situations within the same individual, consistent with his argument that situations are playing a critical role in the expression of all of these, of all 5 facets. What I want to look at next are these individual differences across situations, so the differences between the rows. And I'm going to take a brief tangent and talk about the work of William Fleeson at Wake Forest, who's done some really beautiful work on the big 5 personality traits, which I think is really informative about what's going on in this plot, especially across the rows, and how we should interpret differences between individuals. What Fleeson did was he had participants evaluate themselves on the big 5 personality traits. So how much, and he would do this 3 times a day over the course of 2 weeks every day. He would ring them on their phones. He was using experience sampling. And he would simply ask them on each of these 3 occasions on a given day, how extroverted are you feeling? How conscientious are you feeling? How neurotic are you feeling? And people would just make a judgment. And so he has, for each of the big 5 personality traits, say extroversion, he has a total of 21 judgments in the first week, 3 on each of the 7 days, and another 21 the second week. The first thing he did was just like Michelle, he looked at how well if you took someone's, say, extroversion judgment on one occasion, how well could you predict their extroversion on another occasion. And again, he finds about 0.2 agreement, again, arguing against there being sort of a constant trait level expression of something like extroversion. And again, consistent with the idea that it's the situation someone's in that's driving how extroverted they feel. But then he did a really interesting thing that Seymour Epstein did back in the 70s in response to Walter Mischel's original arguments. What Fleeson did, like Epstein, was to compute the average value for something like, say, extroversion across an entire week. So again, each week included 21 assessments for each trait. So 21 assessments for extroversion, 21 assessments for neuroticism, and so forth. So he would come up with one mean of the 21 assessments for the first week and another mean for the 21 assessments in the second week. And then he looked at how well you could predict someone's extroversion in the second week from their extroversion in the first week. And he found roughly a correlation of 0.9, meaning that if you aggregate the measures of one of these personality characteristics over the course of a week, it was highly stable. Someone who was highly extroverted in one week tended to be highly extroverted in a second week. The thing is that there's tremendous variability about this average over the course of the week. So you have sort of both things going on. You have an individual level effect, but tremendous variability around it. So the issue is then, how do we think about these stable aggregate measures? Do they reflect traits or something else? I'm going to address that in a second, but before I do that, I want to talk about one other thing, which is to look at these overall measures in SAM squared. And so again, basically what would be analogous to what Fleeson did, taking the judgments across a week, is to just take the average across these 48 situations, and which would give you an overall measure for the individual. Again, these people down here would have higher overall measures. These people would have the lowest. And following Fleeson, we haven't done this, but if we took these means and we had people do this again in another week, we would see very high agreement. We've actually done this with the stress data I showed you earlier, and the correlation's about 0.8 to 0.85. So basically, these aggregate measures across situations are highly stable. So the question is, we can get these individual level measures out of SAM squared by averaging the rows. How do they compare with the FFMQ measures? So again, remember the FFMQ would ask 8 questions for awareness, sum those together, which is essentially the same as averaging them. You come up with a measure for the individual. How do those measures for the individual in the FFMQ compare with those measures in SAM squared? And here's the scatter plot that shows the relationship to one another. So down here you have the SAM squared measure of awareness. That's the average across the 48 situations. Here you have the FFMQ measure, which is the sum across the 8 items. And the correlation is only 0.15. These two instruments are measuring very different things. Here are the scatter plots for all 5 facets. And generally, the correlations are quite low. Describe goes as high as 0.45, but non-reactivity, I think one of the most important facets of the big 5 is only 0.13. So these two instruments are measuring very different things. A couple other ways that you can see this is if you take the 10 measures for each individual and you submit them to a factor analysis, so with 5 factors, you would expect that both awareness measures, the one from the FFMQ and the one from SAM squared, should load on the same factor, and the same for the 2 assessments of observe and so forth. But what we find is that none of these 2 measures ever load on the same factor. So the FFMQ measure of awareness loads on factor 2, whereas the SAM square loads on factor 4. So again, this just illustrates how different these 2 approaches are in measuring these 5 facets of mindfulness. Here's one other analysis where we tried to predict the overall FFMQ score with the 5 SAM squared measures. And what's really interesting is that the FFMQ primarily seems to capture describe in non-judgmental from the situated assessment, and it doesn't pick up awareness or non-reactivity at all as it's captured in the situated instrument. So the FFMQ seems to be picking up more about how one describes one's experience and how non-judgmental about it than these other three facets. Okay, so then I think it's useful to ask ourselves, why are these two kinds of assessments differing so much? And I think it's useful to look at the instruments themselves in order to see what might be going on. So again, here are the 8 items from the FFMQ used to measure non-judgmentalness. And what's really striking is that to come up with answers for these 8 questions, what you need to do is come up with find a way to make an abstract assessment about yourself, perhaps drawing on your beliefs about yourself, some ideas of who you are, maybe your identity, but it doesn't seem like you're likely to be pulling up much situational information at all. Or if you are reminded of a situation or two, it wouldn't be nearly as much situational information as for the SAM squared instrument. In contrast, for the SAM squared instrument, you're being asked to evaluate your judgmentalness in each of 48 situations. So there's a tremendous amount of situational information going into these judgments. And when you come up with an overall score, it's heavily based on these 48 situations, whereas this measure is much more based on general knowledge about yourself. And this might explain why these two kinds of assessments differ so much. Okay, so to summarize what we've seen so far, there are clear individual differences. There are clear differences between individuals when you aggregate across situations. But importantly, these aggregate measures across situations differ considerably from non-situated measures like the FFMQ. So the two psychometric approaches are capturing different things. And again, even though there are these individual level differences, there are also very large effects of situations which tend to be larger than the individual effects. And again, there are always large individual by situation interactions, which are often larger than the individual effects as well. And again, we see these across diverse domains, suggesting that this reflects some basic principles of how individuals and situations interact. Okay, so now I want to head off in a more theoretical direction for a second and explore why we might be seeing this pattern of effects. And I want to start with an idea from Al Bandura, who is another amazing Stanford researcher from the same era as Walter Mischel and Lee Crumbach. Lee Crumbach was a little bit before these two guys, but Bandura and Mischel were working at the same time. And Bandura was just about as worked up about the problems with traits as Mischel was. They were both heavily oriented towards the importance of situations. Bandura was perhaps a little bit more interested in action. What Bandura was really, where he was coming from in this notion of reciprocal determinism, he didn't like this idea in trait theory, that you have these internal dispositions which cause expressions of behavior in a unidirectional manner. He thought that this was fundamentally wrong. And he saw all these situational effects that Mischel was reviewing, and it led him to argue this notion of reciprocal determinism, the idea that when someone behaves in a way that might express something like extroversion or conscientiousness, that what's actually happening is that behavior is being co-produced by the individual interacting with the world in a particular situation. And this is what he means by reciprocal determinism. The behavior is being reciprocally determined by both the individual and the situation. And that is a result of reciprocal determinism being a fundamental property of how humans in the world interact. As people find themselves in different situations, this reciprocal determinism is going to cause them to behave in different ways, such that they express different levels of extroversion, for example. Bandura was way ahead of his time because this idea now is extremely high profile in many areas of cognitive science and psychological science. And it's often now referred to as enactment. One older sort of presentation of this idea comes from the classic book by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, The Embodied Mind, where they made a big deal out of enactment. It's essentially the same idea as reciprocal determinism. It's the idea that interactions between an individual and the world co-produce emergent effects. There's an area called 4E cognition, which covers a broad array of research areas in the cognitive sciences, which is essentially arguing the same thing as well. This idea is also very closely related to interdependence in contemplative traditions, the idea that everything is mutually constraining and mutually determining, and you don't have just simple sort of causal entities like traits determining behavior. So to visualize this, again, there's the idea that we have the world and the individual interacting, and as they engage with each other, they co-produce things like cognition, emotion, behavior, adaptation, learning, and at a larger scale, as multiple individuals interact, they enact the social world and they enact the artificial world. And in the process, you see these kinds of effects that we've been seeing throughout this talk emerge as people in all these different domains, cognition, emotion, and behavior. You see large effects of situations, large individual by situation interactions, and you also see stable individual differences. So how might we think about the nature of the process that's taking place between the world and the individual to produce these emergent phenomena, and in particular to produce these three sorts of effects that we've been observing in multiple domains? Something that we have found extremely useful to understand enactment is what we refer to as the situated action cycle. This is a really old idea. What I'm going to show you in a second, it lies at the heart of behaviorism, planning and problem solving in cognitive science, goal-directed action, narrative in all sorts of language domains, reinforcement learning in neuroscience. This is an old idea, and the reason it's been around so much is because it is a fundamentally important idea in our opinion. And we believe that it's a great way to think about this process of enactment because it links together both the environment and the organism. And the idea in the situated action cycle is that things occur in the world that the organism perceives, and this activates states of self-relevance in the organism, how what's happening in the world is relevant for the organism in terms of its goals, values, norms, identity, and so forth. As self-relevance is established, this can produce affect in the body, such as emotion and motivation. This affect in turn can produce action on all sorts of levels. And then finally, these actions produce outcomes, which change the organism and change the world. So this is the process of enactment. The whole thing then iterates continually as people move through situations. And in the process of performing the situated action cycle, the idea is that memory traces get laid down, dopamine circuits become involved, conditioning takes place, and you develop habitual behaviors in specific situations. So this is one way of thinking about enactment. And just to take it one step further, you can think about the situated action cycle as conditioning what Michel and Bandura referred to as people's cognitive affective systems. And these are the systems that produce the situation and individual effects that we've been seeing. And so the idea is that across the lifespan, the conditioning that's taking place in the situated action cycle is shaping people's cognitive affective system. And the primary thing that's happening is that people are learning to produce appropriate responses in the situations that they encounter as they move around in the world. And through the conditioning process, they converge on the correct responses. And because different situations demand different responses, you end up with large amounts of situational variability. Additionally, because the situated action cycle engages all sorts of things that are unique to each individual, like the environment they're in, their goals and values, their motivation, their action repertoire, the rewards that are available to them, the rewards they want to pursue, because all these things are varying. The conditioning process that takes place as the situated action cycle runs causes individuals to experience the same situations in unique ways. Each individual experiences the same situation in different ways because they have a different history of conditioning that has taken place through the situated action cycle. And then finally, stable individual tendencies emerge across situations which Michel and Bangier would not argue are trait mechanisms, but they are sort of central tendencies that cognitive affective systems exhibit as they behave across a wide variety of situations. Some individuals end up being more extroverted on the average, some end up being less, and that's not because there's a trait in the system that is causing this level of extroversion. It's because of a complex pattern of tuning within the cognitive affective system that's resulted from these years of conditioning. So we've been interested in trying to assess the extent to which we can use this sort of idea of conditioning through the situated action cycle to predict people's behavior. Because if this idea is correct, and if the cognitive affective system that's producing people's responses in specific situations has been conditioned by this process, then if we measure this process, we should be able to do a good job of predicting their behavior in relevant situations. And so the approach we take is that we take the situated action cycle and we ask what sort of things are important at each phase for understanding how a person responds to situations in a particular domain. So take our stress study and take distress. What sort of factors enter into this conditioning process that are going to determine the people's level of stress in a given situation? Well, the kinds of things that the literature tells us should be important are how much their expectations are violated, how much they expect to lose or how much they expect to gain, their coping effectiveness, how much they ruminate, how judgmental or compassionate they are, and so forth. And so what we did in this study, this COVID study that I showed you earlier, was we measured the 20 situations on all of these different facets of the situated action cycle that are relevant to stress. And what we argued was that if people's situated reactions to stress reflect the operation of this cycle with these kinds of variables in it, then we should be able to explain each individual stress response as well, even though there are tremendous differences between individuals. And so I don't have time to go into all the details of how all of this was done and how all the analyses work. But essentially what we did was for each individual, we predicted their stress level in each of the 27 situations with their evaluations of these 7 predictors across the same situation. So not only did people evaluate these situations for distress, they also evaluated them for how much expectation violation they experienced, how much threat they experienced, how much coping efficacy they experienced, how much rumination, and so forth. And then we use those judgments to explain the stress in each situation. And so we have a regression for each individual. We can see how much variance that regression explains for the individual. And across the 311 participants, the median explained variance was 81%. That means by taking sort of this conditioning process into account and doing a detailed assessment of it, we're able to explain. So these regressions are capturing all these different effects we're looking at, such as the individual level differences, the situational differences, and the individual by situation interactions. This last analysis I'll show you, and then I will move to the final section, is return to the generalizability results. So as you may recall in this study, these are the variance components for individual situations and the individual by situation interaction. What we did was we essentially predicted all of the distress judgments, the 20,000 distress judgments in this study, with the values from those 7 predictors from the situated action cycle, and then we took the predicted value, and then we took the residual that was left, and we looked at in a generalizability theory analysis, how much of the residuals could be explained by individual situations and occasions. And this shows basically that you can't explain any variance about for the individual situations or in the interaction, there's no variance left to explain because we were able to explain it all with the data collected for that describe the situated action cycle, which basically is the way we interpret this is that we've done a good job of measuring the enactment process that's leading to people's distress and the conditioning that they've experienced over the years, such that we're able to explain their distress with very high levels. And the same thing is true for eustress. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and just talk briefly about potential implications of the kinds of findings that I've been sharing with you, potential implications that they might have for designing contemplative practices and interventions. The first design suggestion might be to try and avoid the traits pitfall, that if you're delivering a contemplative training, don't assume that initial levels of contemplative qualities are fixed traits. Instead, they're likely to be varying widely across situations. So things like mindfulness, compassion, generosity, and so forth don't exist as fixed levels in individuals prior to training. They vary tremendously in the ways that we've been seeing, both across situations and in terms of how those situation effects interact with individuals. Similarly, don't assume that when you help teach someone a contemplative practice, that what you're trying to do is to train a trait, that you're trying to shift their trait level from one level to another. Instead, assume that whatever individual differences exist in a contemplative practice, how mindful someone is on average across situations, how compassionate they are, reflects general tendencies of a complex cognitive affective system. And that what training has done is to shift these tendencies by altering many processes within the cognitive affective system rather than simply shifting a trait. A third thing one might do in contemplative training is to make students aware of situation effects, help students anticipate what their practice experience might be like, that they're likely to experience tremendous variation in practice across situations. And that they're likely to experience large differences in how their practice responds to situations, and that how they respond to situations are going to be very different from how other people respond to situations. This might be going a little bit too far for a contemplative practice, but you could potentially collect data from students prior to training at later points in practice about their levels of a contemplative characteristic such as awareness or non-reactivity, to see how it's varying across situations, to see what kind of situations it's high and low and so forth. Another recommendation is to try and avoid what I like to call the detached cushion illusion. Sometimes, and I think I used to think this way, was that practicing on a meditation cushion was helping me develop a general situation-independent skill that I would later take into the world. And what I didn't recognize for a long time was that sitting on the cushion is actually a situation in itself. When you practice a contemplative skill on the cushion, you're developing a situation-specific skill where you're enacting the contemplative practice in that particular context. In addition, it's important to perhaps be aware that that your practice in that situation may not generalize well to real-world situations. Because all of these behaviors vary so much across situations, what happens on the cushion may look very different than what happens in other situations. Another sort of potential idea for a situated approach to practice would be to identify relevant situations for practice and to actually practice contemplative skills in the context of specific situations. So, for example, an individual who's learning mindfulness might assess a variety of situations in their life, or how distracted they are in them, how reactive, how judgmental. If you were working on pro-social skills, you could evaluate how selfish you are. And then you could target situations where you think it might be good to start your work on a practice. You might also target situations that you would really like to work on, where you would like to change your behavior. But again, the idea is to start working with situations from the start and incorporate them into your training, rather than just working sort of in isolation on the cushion. Another possibility might be to identify easy situations for initial practice, especially situations off the cushion out in the world. And so the idea would be that on the cushion, you start imagining being in these easy situations. You develop what are called implementation intentions for practicing this skill in the world. And then as you get increasingly skilled with the practice, especially in these easier situations, you start practicing the skill in more challenging situations. This would be somewhat analogous to how compassion practice proceeds from practicing compassion with easy individuals to difficult individuals, but with the difference here being that it would be more with life situations instead of with isolated individuals. So in compassion practice, applying a situated perspective might involve not only imagining particular individuals, but imagining particular individuals in particular situations. And the next step would be to take the practice into the world. So after sort of imagining being in these situations and performing the practice, actually taking the practice out into the world. There's a really great book by Chogyam Trungpa called Meditation in Action, where he talks extensively about the importance of doing this and provides a lot of ideas about how to perform this practice. Once you've sort of gone out, taking your implementation intentions out into the world, you can evaluate how successful these attempts were, and maybe go back to the cushion, continue practicing, revising your practice for the next time you go out into the world. Another possibility is to focus on think about practice as situational enactment. I know when I first started practicing on the cushion, I just really didn't take my setting into account. I just thought I was an isolated individual doing this practice. But as I've come to realize, when I'm even doing practice on the cushion, I'm actually in a setting that is supporting that practice. It's usually a quiet setting. It's a positive setting which supports me in that practice. So in this way, even when you practice on the cushion, you're enacting a practice. You're co-producing it in a reciprocal, deterministic manner, as we discussed earlier. Similarly, when you take a practice out into the world, rather than seeing it as the practice coming from a trait that you developed in your practice on the cushion, again, the idea would be to see what you're doing as enacting the practice in the context of the situation you're in, and to explore how the setting supports the practice and how you can leverage the setting to even make your practice work better. One final example would be applications to in engineering interventions for public health sorts of situations. So there may be some public situations that would benefit from contemplative nudges, what you might call contemplative nudges that promote pro-social behavior, such as in hospitals, schools, and factories. So the idea would be that in some of these situations, there might be things one could do to make people less reactive, less distracted, less selfish, and so forth. There's always the ethical question of whether manipulating them in this way without them knowing it is ethical. And my understanding of what's ethical these days is that if the public benefit outweighs the cost to people not knowing that they've been nudged, it's an acceptable thing to do, but it's always important to worry about this. But if you're trying to engineer these kinds of interventions, if you're working from a situational perspective, you could use the kind of situational tools that are out there to identify relevant situational features that are controlling the target behavior, and then develop nudges that minimize barriers to performing the behavior, and that maximize things that would actually enhance performing the behavior. Because we've seen how much people vary in their responses to situations, this would need to be engineered into these interventions as well. You would want to anticipate tremendous variability in how people would respond, and you might want to try to design nudges that work maximally, that have maximal effectiveness across the individual variability that you expect to encounter. Okay, so in conclusion, what I've argued is, first of all, is to be careful about traits and to be aware of their limitations. They may not actually exist in people and be causal mechanisms that are determining their behavior. Instead, they may be primarily be perceived constructions that we impose on the behavior of others, when really what's going on in people's behavior is bidirectional causality between individuals and the world, as these two things enact phenomena like cognition, emotion, and behavior. Additionally, as this enactment is taking place, it's often taking the form of situated action, perhaps following the situated action cycle, that's conditioning people's cognitive affective systems, in the processing, allowing them to adapt effectively to situations, such that you see large situation effects, such that you see large individuals and how people react to the same situations, and also producing overall individual differences, which again one might want to interpret as reflecting traits, but instead just reflecting general tendencies that are being produced across situations by a diverse collection of processes within the cognitive affective system. And finally, I've tried to propose a variety of ways that a situated approach to contemplative design could be used to design new kinds of practices and interventions. Again, with it being important to balance tradition and innovation, and again, being absolutely essential to engage stakeholders. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm interested to hear any thoughts you may have, any questions.
Thank you very much for stimulating presentation, Dr. Barsalou. We are grateful to you for presenting the richness of your multivariate grasp of situations and contemplative practices. One question we have is, in your work, did your colleagues join with you in having a personal contemplative practice? And do you feel that the direct experience of engaging in contemplative practice informed your capacity to take this interconnected impermanence approach to your research?
I don't think any of my colleagues in these projects are practitioners. I certainly would have to say that my years of knowing and working with people in the contemplative science community and the contemplative practice community, my own participation in this community has had a huge impact on my research. It's fundamentally changed the kind of research that I've done, and has I've really shifted my work over the years from basic. For most of my career, I did basic research on the cognitive system, in particular the human conceptual system. And I slowly became increasingly interested in health behaviors and contemplative behaviors. And sort of that whole experience has had a huge impact on my work. And I think that impact is only growing over time.
Thank you. If you would speak about that further in terms of the community of individuals who are working on enactment and embodied cognition, and how you experience the exchange of ideas to be received in other dimensions of public health and psychology when people may not have had the contemplative experience to frame this approach?
Well, I think so. In what's called the 4E tradition, it's enactment, emergence, embeddedness, and embodiment. Um, this is a large community of researchers in which I participated for much of my career as well, which has been sort of reacting to traditional theories in cognitive psychology and cognitive science, which views the mind primarily as a computational device that operates on abstract symbols. Um, and I think a lot of us in this community believe that the body plays a central role in cognition, that situations play a central role, that cognition and emotion and behavior are enacted in the context of the environment, and both physical and social. Um, and uh, and so I think what's really motivating most of these individuals is a reaction against these traditional views and thinking that they're much too narrow and computational and don't really capture the richness of what the brain is doing, what human experience is, what human activity is. And I would say probably the large majority of the individuals in the 4E community are not involved in the contemplative tradition. Certainly there's some overlap. So Evan Thompson is perhaps the prime example of someone who is a central participant in both of these communities. And there are certainly others as well. I would say if you are a contemplative and you're working in things like cognitive science and cognitive psychology, you're probably more likely to take an embodied and an activist position than to take a non-embodied and non-activist position. Yeah, I think contemplative experience does sort of help make people aware of the importance of these kinds of factors in this perspective.
Thank you. And do you have experience with how the 4E community has contributed to the training process for people who are going to do clinical work, whether they're medical doctors or psychotherapists?
Um, yeah, so I mean, we're in an interesting time. The the cognitive revolution occurred in the 1950s and 60s, and sort of the computer metaphor took over until maybe the late part of the 20th century. And then kind of the grounded, embodied, situated views started to take hold, and they have been evolving ever since. And both of these communities still coexist. There's still a lot of people who are still operating from the older perspective, the traditional cognitivist, cognitive science perspective. And the clinical world often lags behind a little bit in terms of how they are framing, say, psychopathology and psychotherapy and the cognitive and affective mechanisms. And so often you may still see vestiges of older approaches still sort of informing kind of the clinical training and clinical work, but increasingly these 4E perspectives are finding their way, and especially notions of embodiment, I think, are increasingly having impact. I think situatedness may be less, maybe more coming in more slowly, but and I think that again that's largely because many people in the psychological and cognitive science community are still working with the older, more traditional views.
Extending this progression from research to clinical work to the next stage of public policy, are there any examples in countries around the world that you would point us to see the implementation of the more embodied approach through public policy?
Whew. That's a great question. So, yeah, I'm increasingly becoming engaged with other people in public health. I actually have a new grant with the public health group here at the University of Glasgow, but I'm still just learning my way around in this world. Um, I guess um, I don't think there's been a lot of impact yet
Mhm.
of this way of thinking in the public health sphere.
Mhm.
Um, I think where you probably see the most. So what's really big in public health these days, a lot of you may know this better than me, is like system level thinking, thinking at the level of the political structure, community structure, class structure, all of those sorts of things, and the sort of the context in which you're trying to produce, implement interventions and change people's behavior. And where psychology comes in is primarily through health psychology. Um, and so you mostly see health psychology influences as opposed to influences from 4E cognition. Health psychology is slowly starting to, you see these kinds of ideas percolating up there somewhat. So I think it may be a while. The thing is that in public health, because people take a systems level view, this is essentially a situated view. They don't think about it like this. So this grant that I'm actually on with the public health team here is about taking a situated approach to measuring mental health in adolescents in secondary schools. And the whole idea is that you want to understand mental health in the situations where it's occurring. And this community really gets how important these situations are. But again, they wouldn't call it situated, they would call it systems level thinking. And I think this is absolutely huge. And I think this is a really big problem with modern psychology is it's too individual oriented and it's not systems level enough. And these folks in public health really often get quite impatient with psychologists because they think they are just too focused on the individual and too oblivious to this system level structure that is so important in determining what people think, feel, and do.
Thank you, Dr. Barsalou, for your inspiring presentation. It broadens our minds and helps us to see how contemplative practice can inform research. We're grateful to you for the work that you do, and thank you for teaching in the Contemplation by Design Summit.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.